When I got this assignment, I was thrilled. Martine is so accomplished in so many different ways, I don't even know where to begin. But let's begin with the beginning. I think a lot of people here are entrepreneurs. They want to start things, they want to shake up things. You've done that time and time again. And along the way, you also transform yourself into a woman. So you've done a lot in a short amount of time. Was there any point where you thought, you know, maybe I'm not going to do that. Maybe satellite radio isn't it. Maybe I can't find a cure for my daughter's disease?
Well, Melissa, it's a great question, and there's so many things to be fascinated about in life, and there's so many opportunities to make the world a better place that, in fact, one of my biggest challenges is saying no to things that I really would like to do. So I would say that Sirius and United Therapeutics, they floated to the top, and they were like, you know, the two absolute best and highest uses of my time. But there were 1,000 other things I would have loved to have done, but there's only so many hours in the day.
You have a lot of famous friends. One of them is the futurist Ray Kurzweil, and he has been quoted as saying that you have a perfect track record of making your visions real. And it does seem, going through your career, that it's not as if you grew up in a suburb of San Diego thinking, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. These are problems that you came across and you decided to tackle. Is that fair?
That is fair, Melissa. Although, you know, to put things in perspective, as you mentioned, there's only like a couple of main projects that I undertook. So 2 out of 2, it's not too hard to have a perfect track record.
2 out of 2, founding a company, taking them both public successfully.
Well, it's been
That's not
great.
bad.
And of course, I can only do this with, you know, teams of hundreds of people working together with me. And I've been blessed to always be friends with super hardworking individuals who are passionate, had an instinct to do the right thing.
Let's talk about some of the things that floated to the top, starting off with Sirius, because this is interesting. You're actually a trained lawyer.
Correct.
And this was also a very circumstance. Mm-hmm. You visited somebody who worked at NASA.
Correct.
And you got the idea.
Correct. So totally true, Melissa, but even there, with whatever your field is, you can always make a connection, which is one of the things I really love about the Emerge conference, is that it's all about making connections for people across different types of technologies and across different borders and whatnot. So with the legal background and Sirius, I found an opportunity in law school at UCLA to specialize in the communications law, dealing with the Federal Communications Commission. And it was a very hot area of law because the government was trying to figure out, how do we allocate spots in orbit above the Earth to different satellite companies? AT&T and, you know, all these different companies wanted those slots, and the government had to find a fair way to give certain slots to certain companies. It was an absolutely fascinating exercise in zoning applied to outer space, and it just really intrigued me. And it turned out that when I had my own company, SiriusXM, and I needed my own slots in outer space, I had the knowledge to do that because of what I learned at UCLA Law School.
Give us the time frame in terms of what time this was, because now, obviously, Sirius, everybody has it in their car.
Sure.
It's not a big deal, but back then, this is completely off the charts.
Believe it or not, Melissa, in the 1980s and 1990s, there was no way at all to receive radio from a satellite. No way at all to receive, stay tuned to the same channel, even driving from, say, Baltimore to Philadelphia, much less, you know, longer distances. No way to have dozens and dozens of finely tuned genres of music. So this was a passion that I had for music. I was frustrated that no matter how many channels there were in a major market, pretty much all you could listen to was top 40 radio. And that passion drove me to SiriusXM. And while it took like 10 years to birth the company and launch the satellites, today there's, you know, hundreds of channels of music that people can listen to coast to coast.
When you take a look at the company now and how it's evolved, I mean, where do you think this industry is going? I would imagine that back then you had detractors, not only as a technology untested, but also what is this going to do to an existing industry? These are real disruptive forces that you're dealing with.
Melissa, it's a great question, and I think that what it came down to was realizing that you have to always figure a way to turn your tool into something which is valued. And in the beginning, a tool is valued for itself. Like with the first person to invent a hammer, I'm sure everybody thought, oh wow, this is like really awesome, I can hammer something. But right after that, you know, when everybody has a hammer, what's the value of a hammer? What's important is a house, is a building, something you make with it. And I think the smartest business decision of SiriusXM was to attract to it the best content available, so that now that we come into a world of immersive digital media, where even the fabric of our clothes literally are going to come alive with microprocessors and memory, the content that you get on SiriusXM is going to be immersive everywhere around us. Satellites will be a way to get the last mile. Like many of us have probably read about Google launching even like balloons and stuff over Africa to get bandwidth to the last mile. Satellites are brilliant to getting it to the last mile, but the great, great value of SiriusXM is content.
Let's talk about the next sort of thing that floated to the top, and that's United Therapeutics, because this is fascinating. You're a trained lawyer, and something happens in your life where you're presented with something that could profoundly change your family life.
Yes, Melissa. While I was at SiriusXM, our youngest daughter was diagnosed with a fatal illness called pulmonary arterial hypertension. And it was a very rare disease. Only 3,000 people in the whole US had it. And the reason for that was that everybody died within 3 to 5 years. So even though it naturally occurs as a rare disease, the total population could never get very large. There were no medicines approved by the FDA for it. Our little daughter was sitting there at Children's National Medical Center in Washington, D.C., literally gasping for breath. The doctors told us maybe she could get a transplant, but it's pretty hard. And I felt I had no choice but to put my heart and soul into trying to find a cure for her. And thank goodness I was able to, and that cure is now one of the main medicines sold by our company, United Therapeutics. Today there are 30,000 people alive with pulmonary hypertension because all those people would have otherwise passed away. And best of all, our daughter is now 30 years old, works at our company in charge of telepresence activities.
You talk about this. It's funny, Martine, because you talk about these things as if it's so natural for somebody to come across a rare and fatal disease and then just go out and said, you know, I have to do something about it. I'm going to find a cure, and now my daughter is alive. That's not the case. This is an amazing thing that you did, and in order to do this, you sold some of your Sirius shares, you started a foundation, you went back to school. I mean, and you found the guy who actually developed a drug and put it on the shelf because nobody wanted it. Exactly,
Melissa. All of that stuff is true, and I have to say that the trials and tribulations of getting a medicine approved are, in my opinion, 10 times more difficult than getting a satellite launched into outer space. It is just a nightmare of false hopes, false starts, disappointments. Drugs don't work. Drugs can't be manufactured. Clinical trial is not done just right. You just miss a statistical endpoint. But when you are powered by the love for your child, I mean, you'll leap like a 10-foot wall. And it got to the point where I really said, I don't care if this is the last thing that I do in my life. I want my daughter to have a life. So applying your problem-solving skills, because they are obviously tremendous, to this drug approval process, what would you say? I mean, if the FDA said to you, what can we do to make this better? I mean, you're in the industry and you've also experienced it. It cannot be, these are life and death situations, getting drugs approved. It should not be harder than launching a satellite. Well, it definitely is. And I think that people, just to give you a statistic, in the satellite launch business, we buy insurance before we launch a satellite because most satellites cost over $100 million. And if it blows up, you want A, your money back, and B, it takes 3 years to build the satellite. So, you know, so the rate of satellites failing is about 1 in 50, okay? But for the chance of getting a drug approved is about, when you start with the drug process, only about 10% of phase 1 drugs get to phase 2. And then only about 30% of phase 2 drugs get to phase 3. Only about half of phase 3 drugs get approved. So you could see there's this tremendous winnowing out process. It's really, really difficult. But the challenge that the FDA faces is that none of us really understand the human body today. It is the most complicated machine you could ever conceive of. There's literally millions and millions of different biochemical interactions. I believe that the best thing that has happened for getting medicines approved faster was the government funding the Human Genome Project and Craig Venter discovering the decoding of the human genome, because this is now allowing us to basically map out the body's biochemistry and accelerate the process of developing new medicines. You're seeing this today with precision medicine and personalized medicine.
We started off talking about that sort of grain of self-doubt that it seems you do not have. When it comes to curing rare diseases, do you think that the time frame is compressed? Do you think that things have changed because of these advancements such as mapping the human genome and precision medicine?
I really do, Melissa. I think we're at a time of accelerating possibilities right now. And conferences like this Emerge conference are really good because they further accelerate that process by networking everybody together. I think that what took maybe like 20 years back in the 20th century is now taking 10 years. And I would say that from the 2020s onward, when we'll have everybody's genome on a desktop computer at their doctor's office, I think the time will be compressed down to 5 to 10 years.
So there is sort of a Moore's law, so to speak.
Totally.
That's applicable to biotech and medicine.
Absolutely. When you have everybody's genome that you could just read like you could read a Google map, the process of developing drugs will ultimately become, insignificant.
Does that make it cheaper? I mean, you're talking about what a small 10% of phase 1 drugs making it through.
Well, the problem is that the cost of something is part of the cost of it is getting it to the patient who needs the medicine. The other part of it is this huge effort to develop the software necessary to analyze the human genome. The biggest area of development in biotechnology today is actually bioinformatics. The actual hardware involved with sequencing the human genome is plummeting in price with machines from companies like Illumina. But the hard thing is developing the bioanalytics to analyze your genome and figure out which medicine will be perfect for whatever ailment you may have. And drug companies will have to capitalize those bioinformatics and bioanalytics. So I don't, speaking of course on behalf of my industry, I think our share of GNP should continue to be about what it is today.
So must be then a sort of catch up then in terms of the technology end of it in this industry. Is that the next push of development in your view?
It is, Melissa. One thing that people find very strange is when I say to them that the purpose of biotechnology is ultimately to defeat death itself. And people say, what? That sounds like crazy. But I say, well, in the 19th century, people died before they were 30. And now the average age is like 60. And now we want people to live past their 80s and 90s. I believe there's something like 100,000 centenarians in the world, people who are 100 years old. So that is what biotechnology does. It keeps pushing the boundary further and further out. And therefore, there will always be new things for biotechnologists to do. There'll always be new medicines for us to develop. The line between enhancement and therapeutics will become more and more blurred. Like if you allow a 100-year-old to say, run a mile, is that enhancement or is that therapeutics?
I guess it depends on the 100-year-old.
The 100-year-old would say, I don't really care, I just want to do it.
Right, you want the possibility
And I think as a society, there's no more important use of society's money than to support the 100-year-old, the 50-year-old, the 10-year-old in having all the health they want to have. Speaking
of pushing boundaries, because that does seem like the perfect sort of label for a lot of what you're doing currently, including trying to transform the organ transplant process. I read one profile, and there are so many on Martine, and they're all unbelievable, but there's one that sets up, you walk into a laboratory and there's a glass box and there's a spongy giant organ in there, and it's a lung. And because it's not in a human body, it's sort of expanded to the size of the box. But that's the next area that you're, that's also pushing the boundaries.
Melissa, it really is. There are about 40% of Americans have signed organ donor cards, which is awesome, and I think everybody should. But the problem is there's the number of people who get organ transplants is a very small percent, around 1% of all the people who need it. And the reason for that is that most organs, when somebody dies and donates them, they're not in good enough shape to be transplanted into somebody who is like, you know, terminally ill. So transplant surgeons only want to transplant a pristine organ. What we figured out a way to do, starting with the lung, is to put it in sort of an artificial body, this glass jar that you described, and treat the organ as a patient for a few hours until we get that organ looking good enough to transplant, and then allow it to be transplanted. Already, the doctors we've worked with have now transplanted over 300 of these recovered lungs, which otherwise would have gone into the trash can. And each one of those recovered lungs is a person's life who has been saved that would have otherwise died on the transplant list. So this technology has already crossed the border and saved 300 lives.
Wow. And the genesis of this pursuit is also in part Genesis, because most people of primary pulmonary hypertension die waiting for a lung transplant.
That's correct, Melissa. Yes. So when our daughter was told that, well, we were told that she would need a lung transplant because there are no medicines approved for this, I threw sort of like half of my brain into working on the medicine and half of my brain into thinking about the end game and working on the transplant. The medicines have come sooner, and they've been able to stabilize the conditions of lots of the patients with pulmonary hypertension. But many more patients with pulmonary hypertension, unfortunately, the disease progresses through the medicine, not to mention the people with pulmonary fibrosis, cystic fibrosis. I'm a Trekkie, a Star Trek person. I was so sorry to hear that Leonard Nimoy, Mr. Spock, ended up dying of COPD. And if there were lung transplants, he could have been saved from the COPD. So I'm just really jazzed about the fact that we live in a time and place when we can adopt a goal of creating an unlimited supply of transplantable organs. And that's not science fiction, that's a doable do.
I mean, it's being done now.
It's being done right now.
Can you apply this to other organs, or is really lung the organ that's most suitable for this?
We're focusing, our company focuses on the lung because our products are pulmonary medicine products, but the same technology is being applied by other groups and individuals to the lung, the kidney, and the liver. I think that we can imagine a day within the next 20 years when there is an unlimited supply of organs for people with all different end-stage organ failure.
Wow, so you think that there will be a day when nobody dies waiting for an organ transplant?
That's correct, that's correct. That's something, that's a problem that technology positively definitely can solve. I'm more sure of that than I was of when I started Sirius XM, that cars could receive satellite signals from satellites a sixth of the way to the moon.
There are a lot of people, scientists, also working on alternatives to human organs. Do you think that that will be a viable solution, or do you think that a solution like yours is more likely to be the predominant course of treatment?
I think that's a viable solution too. I think artificial organs are a good solution. Artificial hearts are already used to save a great many people's lives. I'm a big believer in sort of, you know, don't put all of your eggs in one basket. And I'm the last person to dissuade anybody from pursuing a technologically promising path.
Right. It's funny because you said you use half your brain thinking of a treatment and half your brain thinking about the end game. But at the same time, at this point, you're using some other part of your brain.
The other half.
To think about another end game,
third half.
which is mortality, because you're also very into artificial intelligence and thinking about life beyond the death of your body.
Yes, so while I was developing these technologies, I was able to be introduced to Ray Kurzweil, who you mentioned, the author of The Age of Spiritual Machines and Singularity is Near. And I heard several of his lectures, and he puts out a very, very persuasive case that Moore's Law is continuing to increase the potential of computing technology at a constant price. And he has a number of charts and graphs that shows that by around 2030, software and computing hardware will be equal to the capability of the human brain. So being an individual who's working in keeping people alive by transplanting their organs, I think it was not a very big stretch for me to ask myself, well, what if you transplanted their minds to software? Would they be able to stay alive in software while perhaps technology continued to advance? And just like we regenerate lungs and we regenerate hearts, perhaps ultimately people can regenerate brain tissue, and their minds can then be written back into brain tissue. It may take many, many decades. It may take, over a century. But what appealed to me, Melissa, was that Ray Kurzweil was not violating any laws of physics. And I love this great quote from Elon Musk. He says, he only pursues things that don't violate the laws of physics. And I would say I'm a card-carrying member of that club. Taking a mind and offloading it to software is consistent with physics. Mm-hmm. It's something I think will be done this century.
Whereas violating a law of physics would be freezing a brain, or what? Can you walk through that?
I think violating a law of physics would say that you could like snap your finger and a brain would appear on the moon, because it would be traveling then faster than the speed of light.
Oh, that didn't even cross my mind.
Right. See, you're a good scientist, Melissa. You're only thinking. You're a good scientist. You're thinking consistent with the laws of physics. A big thing that we do as engineers is we go step by step by step. And just like Elon Musk, again with Tesla, he started with like a very expensive Roadster, and then the Model S, and then brought the price down a little bit. Next is coming the SUV, and then like a $30,000 car, the Nissan Leaf, Audi, Mercedes, everybody is doing it. I tried to do the same thing in biotechnology, go step by step by step. So first we created a nonprofit foundation where people can create what we call a mind file. And it's just like a repository for all of their Instagram posts, their Facebook posts, Google+, whatever. And all these things are automatically copied into a mind file. And so in the future, when software does catch up with Kurzweil's predictions, all of their thoughts and memories will be there, and it could be reactivated. Whether that reactivated mind file really is conscious or not, it'll be an experiment. People will have to say, probably psychologists and lawyers will have to determine that. And I often tell audiences of high school students that 2 super great careers for the future that I can promise them will have unlimited possibilities are cyberpsychology, the psychology basically of software minds, and cyber law. Well, cyber law is already here.
Right. And when you say mind file, I read somewhere that it included things like Twitter posts,
yes,
Facebook posts,
yes,
and Amazon orders.
Yes. Well, because that, I would say if you wanted to understand most of us, you probably understand us best looking at our Amazon orders.
I guess that's true. And now that they have groceries,
right.
you really understand.
Everything's there, for sure.
But this sounds like you're sort of just taking a snapshot of a person's mind at any given time and storing that. You're not actually storing how the person thinks or how the person feels.
Correct. I think that other people are working on that right now. Google bought the best robotics companies in the world and the best companies that developing mindware, mind software. Facebook's in a similar area. So what mindware would be software that analyzes all those static uploads and looks for a pattern within that and matches that pattern to the way you characteristically think. Like it'll look at your videos, it'll look at your talking, and just like a forensic detective can look at a person's behaviors and figure out kind of what their motives are and their intent is, software will be able to, forensic software will be able to discern our personality from all of our actions.
There is a robot that you've developed in the likeness of your wife.
That's true.
So what exactly is this robot? Is this also a mind file, a snapshot of what your wife's memories and Facebook posts and Amazon orders are right now?
It is. It's exactly that, Melissa. And this Bina 48 robot, as we call it, is kind of like what we call it in technology development a breadboard, or kind of like just a practical experiment to see how close are we today to creating a cyber consciousness. And it amazes me that when journalists come and interview Bina 48, they all kind of say the same thing, which is like sometimes it's frustrating, but sometimes I get these flashes of human insight. And Bina 48 says things that Bina has never said. It puts together all different parts of her life.
Are they Bina-like?
They are Bina-like. It is, I would say, it's sort of like a 1-year-old or 2-year-old version of Bina, which would make sense because the robot's just a couple years old.
I guess that does make sense. What do you think this robot or this kind of robot will eventually be capable of doing?
I think eventually it'll be capable of having its own consciousness, its own autonomy, its own desires, its own wills.
Its own organic thoughts.
Its own organic thoughts. I think it will eventually want to be respected as a separate individual from Bina. And the lawyer in me says eventually it's going to want its own legal rights. And of course, you know, that was the hook that got Stephen Colbert very interested in it. And there's a great Colbert episode that you can stream where he gets into the point that robots will search the web and they'll read about all the human activities to gain human rights. And whereas humans, it took us millennia to get our rights, the robots will get that like in a nanosecond. And as soon as they're conscious, they'll say, you know, we want rights.
Now, all this sounds kind of scary. I mean, doesn't it sound a little scary? I mean, when people think of science fiction and the rise of the machines and robots taking over the world, I mean, what you're describing really does sound like that, and you're saying that that's possible.
I don't think it sounds scary to me. I mean, I know Hollywood movies make it look scary, but you know, if you were really taking Hollywood movies serious, like Fast and Furious, I mean, you wouldn't even drive your car. So, you know, I think the reality is that humans are comprehensively in control of this planet. There's 8 billion of us, soon there'll be 10 billion of us. We're in control of everything. We are the environment that computers operate in. And so for computers to survive in this environment, they have to be friendly to us. They have to be nice to us. Computers will take a cue from dogs. You know, dogs proliferated because they were friendly and nice to us, and we fed them in turn. Cats, the same things. And the market for a mean robot, I mean, who's going to buy a mean robot? It's like, what's the market for like a bad car, a lemon car? How many cars sold that like the gas pedal gets stuck? You know, none. So the natural Darwinian process of the socio-economic environment will ensure that robots are friendly.
So don't be afraid of robots. But it will be a very disruptive force. I would imagine for so many industries, people would be afraid of robots in the context of taking a job from a human being, because robots are more efficient. You don't have to pay them. You just have to buy them. You don't have to feed them, et cetera.
You know, that's the history, Melissa, of technology and the economy. There was a time when people said, like, you know, literally tens of thousands of people were employed in digging canals, like the Erie Canal, the C&O Canal. And now we dredge those canals with big bulldozer machines, and we would think it was like slavery to make human beings go down there and dig all those canals. Human beings move on to higher and higher forms of employment. If you said to somebody, we were talking about the 80s, if you went back to the 80s, you said to somebody, what do you do? I'm a web developer. It's like, you know, what do you do, make spider webs or something? I mean, people wouldn't even know what you were talking about. So I believe that actually employment is exploding. Here we are 25 years after the internet was formed, and the employment rate in the US is like 5%. It's like no different than it was 25 years ago. Most of those old jobs are gone, but there's much cooler, better jobs available. And I think it's the same thing with robots. They will serve us, but things like being a cyberpsychologist, a cyber lawyer, people deciding to do cool things like invent things that never existed before, the sorts of things that people like the folks at Google are working on to extend human life with Calico. There'll be gazillions of jobs for humans, and I think robots will just be extenders of ourselves.
What's interesting in speaking to you about all these things is that it's almost as if you want to blur every boundary there is. You want to blur the boundary between life and death, for instance, and you also believe the same way about gender. There's a lot of hang-up about he or she. You don't fall in that camp. Why not?
Well, I think it's like, to me, the way I look at things is like at borders are things that humans impose on reality and limit themselves. And instead, what I'm kind of just saying is, like, you know, open your eyes, and if you look at the world realistically, these are just borders that are not real. They're human constructs. Whether it's gender, limiting everybody to being either male or female, or saying that everybody has to live 70 years and then die. You know, why can't people live to be 100? Why can't we have more jobs in the future than we have now, and all of the drudgery jobs are done by robots? None of these borders are determined by God. They're determined by man and women. And so what I'm just trying to do is say, be realistic. The only borders we create are the ones we create in our own minds. Right,
but people are fascinated with this border. I mean, there's a New York Times editorial called "The Quest for Transgender Equality," and it was extremely extensive, and it said things like, being transgender remains unnecessarily hard to this day, and that there's a fascination with it, but oftentimes in a prurient way. So people are just curious. Do you think that, do you consider yourself, because you're a scientist, you're an entrepreneur, do you consider yourself one of these people at the forefront trying to level that field? Does that matter to you?
It does matter to me. Melissa, I've got like lots of transgendered friends, and the vast majority of them have had tremendously more difficulties than I ever had. I have transgendered sisters and brothers who have been killed, who have killed themselves, and the amount of pain that people suffer who break out of the borders of male and female is terrible. So anything that I could do to speak out on behalf of acceptance of transgendered, celebration of transgendered people, I'm always going to do.
I want to talk about what your mind, whatever portion is left of it, is looking at next. I think everybody wants to know, what is the next problem Martine Rothblatt is going to conquer?
I'm actually totally focused on continuing to build our company, United Therapeutics. It's such an exciting company. We just last month won approval for our first orphan oncology drug, Unituxin. This is the first medicine the FDA ever approved for neuroblastoma, a horrible form of cancer that afflicts young children. And we now are also working on creating an unlimited supply of transplantable organs. We have other medicines that are in the queue for defeating viral plagues, such as Ebola, and these type of new pandemic viruses that are literally, percolating from the ecosystem all the time. So I have found my ultimate love being the head of United Therapeutics. It takes up all of my time and attention, and if I could just devote myself to that, inspire other people from my example, break open some borders so people can be more free, I'm as self-actualized as I could ever ask to be.
So it sounds like you're pretty booked in terms of what you want to deal
yes,
with.
Yes.
But when you take a look at technology as a whole or science, what are the areas you think could use some transforming?
I think that the field of medicine can use a lot of transforming. We do things in a very old school way, that we test drugs on hundreds or thousands of people. It takes years to do these clinical trials. Instead, I believe that we should be able to simulate an entire human body in silico, meaning in software. Just like meteorologists simulate the entire world's weather on computers, and they tell us, okay, if you keep pumping all this carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the global temperature will go up by 6 degrees or whatever. We should be able to create an entire human body in software, and then we should be able to inject a drug into that software body as just uploading some code. And the digital code would represent the drug, would represent the shape of the molecule of that drug. And in the software system, it would interact with the code that represents our body. And we would know within 5 seconds whether or not that drug worked or didn't work. One of our partner companies, Craig Venter's Synthetic Genomics, is doing exactly that right now. So I believe the field of synthetic biology, which is this field of making software versions of the human body, will do more than anything else to democratizing healthcare and a good quality of life across the entire planet.
How far off is that, do you think?
The huge startup opportunities are in it right now. Intrexon in Maryland is another great company working on this. And I would say within the next 10 to 20 years, you'll have companies that are 10 times bigger than any of the pharmaceutical companies today from synthetic biology.
So this is all part of the process. When we were talking earlier about compressing the timeline of approving a drug and getting a drug, this is all part of it.
It is, Melissa.
Yeah. So just the artificial
bioinformatics.
There are no mice. There aren't going to be mice.
No, mice are seriously old school.
Yeah. We'll just have a software
Everything, your body will be software simulated. If a person has, say, like rheumatoid arthritis, people will be able to modify the code on a computer to create a body that has rheumatoid arthritis. Scientists have ideas of different molecules that will work for rheumatoid arthritis. Instead of recruiting hundreds of patients at dozens of hospitals over many, many months or years, instead they'll just code the molecule, push return, the molecule will go into the body, It will ameliorate or not ameliorate the symptoms of rheumatoid arthritis. If it works, they'll push another button, and that code will then be printed out, 3D printed out as an actual molecule. Synthetic genomics is actually doing that right now in San Diego. And then that actual molecule can be produced to good quality manufacturing processes, distributed to pharmacies, and people will take it, and rheumatoid arthritis be gone.
And it's not just rheumatoid arthritis.
All different, I just used it as one example.
Just one example.
So I mean, like, you talk about jobs, that's jobs for like tens of thousands of people.
Right.
You know, if I was like a junior high school or elementary school student right now, or high school, I'd like go into biology, go into informatics. The possibilities are limitless.
You talk, I mean, you're a scientist by training and you're an entrepreneur also, but do you ever think about when you push these boundaries that the infrastructure around it is not ready for that sort of innovation? Like, for instance, in artificial intelligence, the laws have not caught up or may not catch up until there's an actual Bina 48 who's demanding her rights.
Yeah, you're totally right, Melissa. And by the way, we should be glad it's like that. In some countries, everything is illegal unless like the government specifically makes it legal. I would much rather be in a country like the US where everything is legal unless the government specifically makes it illegal. So I was very heartened to read the article recently that self-driving cars are popping up in all these different states and there are not any laws preventing it, which I think is a good thing. Ultimately, there'll be a need for a law after every accident, and you know that's the way laws come about. So there will need to be laws that will govern artificial intelligence. I think it would be wrong if people created tortured artificial intelligences and did that, like cruelty to artificial intelligence would be wrong. But I would rather that science proceed first and law follow afterwards, rather than just being smothered under a blanket of laws.
Right. Going back to this idea of the movies in science fiction, because part of this conference we talk about cybersecurity as well. Are you afraid that there could be the potential for a hacker, maybe a terrorist, to eventually hijack an AI robot?
Oh, it'll definitely happen.
It'll definitely happen.
I mean, every place where you go to a frontier, first come the frontier people who like just, you know, pave the frontier. And right after them, there's always a criminal element that comes in and tries to take advantage of the situation. Cyberspace is a frontier, and it only took like, you know, a few years after the beginnings of cyberspace for there to be hackers and, you know, malevolent viruses, cyber viruses and whatnot. So it'll happen, but that happens with every technology. I mean, how long do you think it happened, it took between some cavemen discovering fire and bringing fire back to their cave, and then somebody starting to burn somebody else with a fire? I bet you it didn't take too long, you know? There's about, one thing I point out in my new book, Virtually Human, is that about 1% of the population naturally has a kind of mutation in their neurochemistry that leads to antisocial personality disorder. And that's just a natural thing that perks up in the human population. It can be treated, but sometimes it's not treated. And we read in the papers about people being shot and whatnot all the time. So cybercrime, cyber violence, it's 100% inevitable. But that's not a reason to like throw away our smartphones. I mean, that would be crazy, right? You know? So instead, what we need to do is develop cyber defenses, develop better and better encryption algorithms, and keep moving forward. And don't be afraid for a little bad thing to stop a big good thing.
Right. We've been talking about a lot of big, hefty concepts and problems, and you mentioned smartphones. I was just wondering, do you ever think about applying your knowledge and the way you think to small things? I mean, what do you think about drones and self-driving cars? Are these too small issues for you to think about, or how does this?
No, there's no issue. There's no issue that's too small for me. It's just like I only got 24 hours, so and I spend a lot of those hours just doing things which are enjoyable too. So in the time that I've got for working each day, I focus on the biotechnology. There's no way that I could out Elon Musk on electric and self-driving cars. There's no way that I could out Google the Google folks on artificial intelligence. So I've got total confidence that other people in the economy are moving all these things forward. And I want to really stay tightly focused on creating an unlimited supply of transplantable organs.
Right. So what stage is that currently in terms of the organs?
Yeah, so we're at the first stage that we take organs that would otherwise be thrown away, disposed of, and we take those and we restore them to be transplantable. The second stage is going to be genetically modifying pigs so that the pigs' organs can be transplanted into humans. There are 100 million pigs eaten in the US each year, so there's a huge supply of pigs. By a weird fluke of nature, pig hearts, lungs, kidneys are the same size, shape, and function as humans. My grandmother, way back in the 1970s, received a pig heart valve in lieu of her failing heart valve. But it was not vascularized, it was just the shape of the valve, but even the pig's heart valve matched the human shape. So we now are in a partnership with several companies to develop a genetically modified pig whose lung will not be rejected when it's transplanted into the human body. And our goal is by the end of this decade, with the progress we're making, to be able to transplant one of these, what are called xeno lungs. Xeno is the prefix from an animal source. Xeno lungs into an end-stage lung disease patient and return that patient safely back to health. So I think we'll do that before 2020. And then our next stage is to take inducible pluripotent stem cells. These are cells that each of us have. You can take any cell from your body and you can chemically treat it to return it to being a stem cell. And that's why stem cells went from being very rare things in sort of like the Bush administration to being things that every university campus is making their own stem cells now. So we're working now to redifferentiate the stem cell down a pathway that would make it either differentiate into a heart or differentiate into a lung or into a kidney. And so if a person needed a replacement organ, they would have a replacement organ grown of their very own DNA from their very own stem cell. And that's a project that we would hope to be completed by the end of the next decade, by the end of the 2020s.
And this is not pie in the sky. I mean, these are the projections that you tell investors in your company. It's a publicly traded company, but this is what you tell them.
Absolutely, and they're very, very excited because people realize that there are in the U.S., just talking about lungs, for example, there are 400,000 people in the U.S. that die of end-stage lung disease each year. And the amount of hospital bills that are spent in your last year of life with end-stage lung disease is over $100,000. So if you could, instead of spending $100,000 for year after year, if you could restore somebody to good health with a xenograft or a regenerated lung, it would be literally a $100 billion market in regenerated organs. I think most people in the biotech sector realize that first there were small molecules, stuff like aspirin and Celebrex, things that we know of as small molecules. Then there were biologic molecules, what we call monoclonal antibodies, the kind of drugs that are Epogen from Amgen that are bestsellers today. And the next biologic is going to be whole tissues, which people are already beginning to develop. Then after tissues, you get whole organs. So biotech investors are onto this, and they are already investing in companies like Intrexon and Synthetic Genomics and United Therapeutics, which are on this track.
Yeah, there are a lot of hedge funds actually going into a lot of those companies, seeing the potential. I'm wondering though, are you worried that there's some other startup or company out there? Another theme at this conference is competitive moats. And as an entrepreneur, you're always thinking of that. I mean, the moats are very different in biotech. I don't know if there are many people who are thinking, oh, we can have an endless supply of organs if we modify pig DNA and have them grow organs that are more suitable for us. But are there?
There are.
Oh,
there's over a dozen different companies working on that, well over a dozen. And I welcome it. My experience is that in healthcare and biotech, competition is really co-opetition. That by each of us competing and raising people's attention about a disease, more people are diagnosed with that disease, it's discovered by doctors, and the overall market rises up. In our field of pulmonary arterial hypertension, we have three main competitors, United Therapeutics, Gilead, and Actelion. When we started 15 years ago, total revenues in this market were about $50 million. Today, total revenues in this market are about $5 billion. So competition builds markets, competition keeps us sharp, competition makes us move past borders, past barriers. So I think if there's no competition somewhere, it means there's no market.
Okay. And last question, we talked a lot about pushing the boundaries. I mean, when you think about your own life, do you think that you are going to be that person, that 100-year-old person who will run a mile? Do you think that you will have a mind file and achieve some level of immortality?
So I'm pretty much a live like day for day kind of person. I don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about like 100 years from now, but I do have a mind file. Yeah, well, day for day is pretty awesome and exciting for me. But I do have a mind file, and I think basically everybody who's on Facebook, Instagram, anybody who's on social media has a mind file, whether they call it that or not. And I believe that we will, in the future, think about not living to 100 the way we think now about our ancestors who died before they were 30.
Wow. Martine, thank you for your
My
time.
pleasure, Melissa.
I'm Dr. Martine Rothblatt, CEO of United Therapeutics.